Hello and welcome to Year 12 Biology. Today's video is going to go through aquatic ecosystems. Syllabus objective today is all around using different indices and interactions to compare ecosystems. So today we're going to go through the characteristics of aquatic ecosystems, and next video is going to focus on terrestrial ecosystems. So we'll be able to make comparisons. Let's start easy. What is an aquatic ecosystem? Well, it's the living organisms that exist in a water-based habitat and the abiotic conditions that go with that. It includes things like oceans, lakes, rivers, reefs, marshes, those sorts of things that are mostly water-based. That can be freshwater or saltwater, or a combination of both. So it can be our oceans. About 70% of the world is covered with oceans. It's mostly salt water, and it contains a huge variety of life. Could be lagoons and lakes, which are freshwater, but they're generally bigger than ponds. Lagoons are generally larger than ponds, and lakes are larger than lagoons. Most of them are freshwater, and they contain a variety of life. Ponds, we get a lot of ponds out in the outback of Australia. They tend to be ephemeral. They come and go, they disappear. They can be natural or man-made. And you'll find a smaller but still divergent range of species living in them. Rivers contain fresh water that moves. So it could be a full-on river, it could be a stream, it could be a fast-flowing, full of waterfalls kind of deal, or it could be a really slow moving flat river along a floodplain. That has a bunch of different things that are important because if it's fast flowing and it's mixing up, you've got a lot of oxygenation in the water, probably high turbidity as well, as it's eroding and carrying away the sediments around it. Whereas as it gets to the slow floodplains, it starts to drop out the sediments, the water gets a little bit clearer, and it generally has less oxygen in it. So it could be any of those things. They tend to be transitory, non-permanent, especially when you consider that we're comparing them to oceans. Oceans have been there for a very, very long time, pretty much since the world began, and they'll be there well after we're dead. Whereas a stream can change its course, a lake can dry up, and a pond frequently disappears. All freshwater ecosystems tend to be relatively shallow. Even those that when you're swimming in them, they feel really deep. Compared to an ocean, they're shallow. And they contain a less variety of living organisms when you compare them to the ocean because they're relatively shallow and they're relatively non-permanent. Shallowness can have positive effects, but it has more negative effects. Why would living in shallow water be a good thing? Well, it means nutrients are readily available, lots of food, especially if you are a photosynthetic organism. You get to float around in all this fresh water, just soaking up sunlight. There's no problem with water pressure because if you go really, really deep, more and more water stacked on top of you, that gets a lot of pressure, and that means you can't have things like jellyfish living very far down in the oceans because the pressure will squish them. It's a good thing to live in water, any kind of water, because it means you are more buoyant. It helps hold you up. A jellyfish doesn't do so well on land because air isn't very buoyant. It doesn't hold you up. You need some kind of exoskeleton or internal skeleton to hold up your flesh. Freshwater is less buoyant, slightly, than salt water. So in the salty water, jellyfish do better than in freshwater. The negative side effects, the downside of living in shallow water, well, you are very reliant on seasonal variations in depth. You see that in the Australian outback a lot, where you've got pools that can be really deep, but as they dry up because of hot sunny days and evapotranspiration is where it goes through a tree. Evaporation, the difference between the wet season and the dry season can be dramatic. Another one is that the ion and salt variations can vary with location, even in the same river. If you go and test for how salty the water is up the top of a stream where it's near its source up in the mountains, you'll find that it's very low in salt. But if you go all the way down to the estuary where the mouth of the river starts to approach the ocean, it becomes more salty because of the tidal influence. Temperature variations between night and day, if you're in shallow waters, can be quite dramatic. But if you're in a larger body of water, you're a bit more resistant to temperature changes because they have this thermal inertia. It takes a lot more energy to heat up a big body of water. That's why our oceans don't change temperature very easily. Oxygen levels decrease as water temperature increases. So if you're living in a tiny little pond and it is a really scorching 45-degree day out there and the sun is beating down, that water is getting hot. And as it gets hot, it can hold less oxygen. So not only are you boiling in that little pool, you're also struggling to get enough oxygen. In shallow water, you tend to have turbid water. Therefore, less light gets to the bottom of the body of water. So turbidity is the amount of sediment that is floating around in the water. And deep water is in ponds. Deep water is low in oxygen because the oxygen has to enter through the surface of the pond or river. It has to actually enter the surface. So deep down, it just doesn't diffuse in. That's not the same in marine environments all the time, though. Adaptations to life in freshwater. What does it take? So if you are a fish living in freshwater, you are effectively living in a hypotonic solution. You need to be able to osmoregulate, because osmosis is going to make the water move from an area of high concentration of water to low concentration of water. So compared to the outside environment, there is more water molecules on the outside than on the inside of their body, because we've got like proteins and sugars and all sorts of other ions inside the fish. Therefore, water is going to move into the fish and blow it up. Not a good thing. So fish have adapted to have scales, nice hard impermeable scales, and a layer of mucus on them to reduce the amount of water that moves through their skin. Insects and crayfish have hard exoskeletons that stop water from moving in and out. And most fish have gills that absorb salts from the water because they need those salts. Every time they pee, they're losing some. And yes, fish do pee. And most complex organisms like fish and sharks and all those sorts of things, they have to have complex excretory organs to pump out excess water and keep as many salts in as they possibly can. We have multiple methods, but this is one method of stratifying freshwater environments. And we do that by determining the amount of light, and we use the amount of light as our indicator of where the different zones begin and end. The first one is the littoral zone. There's the limnetic zone, the profundal, and the benthic zone. The littoral zone is the shoreline zone. It includes everything around the edges of the shore, from the bank all the way into the water. It varies greatly in size and depth depending on where it is, what kind of river or lake we're talking about, and how deep it is and how old it is. It's typically shallow compared to the rest of the lake. It has lots of nutrients and lots of runoff from the surrounding environment, and therefore lots of stuff likes to live there and grow there. In open water, we have the limnetic zone. So it's just as shallow as that littoral zone, most of it, but there's no land. It's the warmest part of the lake and it receives the most sunlight. Therefore, you get lots of photosynthetic floating organisms like water lilies and algae that love to live in this zone. Because there's lots of oxygen in the limnetic zone as well, because there's lots of surface area for diffusion here of oxygen in, lots of fish are going to want to live there as well. The profundal zone is what we call the bottom zone. All the water that pools at the very bottom, it's deep, it has low light levels, depending on what type of ecosystem we're talking about. It could be a little lake like this, or it could be a river. If it's got high turbidity, lots of muddy water, it means the light's not going to get down the bottom there. Usually it gets colder temperatures than the top because the heat from the sun just isn't going through there, and therefore, because you've got less surface area for oxygen to diffuse, you also get less oxygen. So even though the water is colder water has the capacity to hold more oxygen, there's less opportunity for oxygen to actually get in there. So most of profundal zones in lakes and ponds tend to have less oxygen and therefore less life. And the benthic zone is what we call the bottom, where you can actually walk along the bottom. That's where bacteria tend to live. They love to go down there and decompose any organic matter, dead fish carcasses, bits of algae, whatever is raining down from the top that's died. They love to decompose it at the bottom there. If you've got older or stagnant still water, you end up with a larger benthic zone. You get this sludge build up at the bottom. Whereas if you've got fast flowing water or a very young body of water, you don't tend to have that big benthic zone yet. We also get temperature stratification occur in fresh water because if you've jumped into a pool during summer, you've felt this. The first foot or so, if you put your hand in, the first few centimetres are really warm, and then as you keep going down to the bottom of the pool, it gets really cold. That's what we call a thermocline, where the top layer of warm water, because hot things expand, you've ended up with water that has less density than the colder water, and you end up with this warm water band and the cold water band settling at the bottom. And they have names for those. You're not required to know these names. You just need to know that a thermocline is a layer, a distinct layer between warm water above and cold water below. And every river, every lake gets this kind of temperature stratification happening. And that has some pretty cool effects when you're looking at how rivers move and how things mix up in rivers. Let's switch over to marine ecosystems. Let's add some salt to this. We know that it's our biggest aquatic ecosystem. 71% of the Earth's surface is covered with ocean, and oceans are really important because they provide all the fresh water that we need on land and they regulate the Earth's temperature. But what does it take to live in salt water? Well, for a fish, it's the absolute opposite of living in fresh water. Instead, now we're in a hypertonic solution, a really salty solution. That really salty solution has less water compared to the inside of the fish. Therefore, water is going to go from high to low and leave the fish's body. This poor fish is going to dehydrate unless it does something about it. In some organisms, like marine invertebrates, they're snails and things like that, they actually are osmoconformers. They simply mimic the internal and external environment. They maintain the same water and salt balance as that environment. So as it changes, so does it change inside their bodies. But marine vertebrates like fish, dolphins, all of those, we have to do something or we're going to dehydrate. All that water is going to leave, and that's not good for our bodies. Many marine invertebrates have specialized glands to excrete salt from their body because all that extra salt that builds up, and we have a complex urinary system to ensure that we excrete lots of salt ions and hold on to as much water as we possibly can. What is plankton? Plankton loves to live in oceans. Plankton plays an enormous part in all food chains and in sustaining life on Earth. They're microscopic plants and animals, and they float around in the water column. Phytoplankton are the producers. They are little tiny microscopic photosynthetic plants, and zooplankton are the microscopic animals. There are entire food chains and food webs just on this microscopic level amongst the plankton. It's a whole drama going on down there. So there are some plants, microscopic plants like algae that are eaten by herbivorous plankton, which are then in turn eaten by predators in the plankton. But as a whole, plankton also forms the base of most of our marine food chains. And this is what plankton looks like. If we take a sample of water and put it under a microscope, we get all these amazing, beautiful, complex microscopic forms. So this one is a plant A lot of the green ones you can see, there's coccolithophores. Some of these are animals. You can see that they don't have a cell wall on them. And they're all at the microscopic level, and they're all incredibly diverse and unique. So these are a few different ones that you get. Zooplankton, you get lots of little larval forms of many of the larger organisms that you see in the marine ecosystem. Little copepods, lots of blue crabs. You get lots of different phytoplanktons as well. What is nekton? So if plankton is microscopic, nekton is not microscopic. It includes all the things you and I are used to talking about living in the ocean, including Nemo, sharks, dolphins, turtles, rays, all the stuff we are used to talking about as organisms, animals living in the ocean, are nekton. We stratify the oceans as well into different zones, again based on light, how much light penetrates, but it's also based on salinity and temperature in the oceans, because salinity plays an enormous role in driving various processes in the oceans. And it comes about because warmer, less salty, less dense water rises to the top, and the cold, rich, salty water sinks to the bottom. Near the equator, water gets heated up and evaporated. So as it evaporates, it turns into clouds and moves off over the land to form rain, hail, sleet, all the rest of the stuff that we love falling from the sky. But as that water is evaporated, it increases the salinity and therefore the density of that water, causing it to sink. And as it sinks, it cools, which, as we know, colder things contract, brings the particles slightly further together, which also increases its density, so it continues to drop. As water warms, it becomes less dense and rises. Sometimes we have fresh water at rivers also coming in and diluting the seawater, which makes it less dense and more likely to rise. And it's the difference between that cold, salty, dense water and the tropical water, which is diluted by runoff. It's warm, so it rises. And it's that difference between the two that causes ocean currents to form. We have global currents formed by this thermohaline, the differences between temperature and salinity in the ocean. So we end up with this global thermohaline conveyor belt, otherwise known as circulation pattern. The red paths are the warm water in the surface running up and along, running the wrong direction there. And the blue is where it sinks down and runs along the bottom of the ocean. As it comes towards the equator, it warms up again and rises. As it hits the poles, you get these deep water formations where the water is cooling and dropping. We also divide the ocean into depths: the littoral, the baffle, the abyssal, the hadal or hadal, and the benthic zone. The benthic is literally the surface at the bottom, so it can be at various depths. You can have benthic organisms that live only a few meters down, or you can have benthic organisms that live 6,000 meters down. The first one, the littoral zone, that's the one we're going to study when we go to Hastings Point. It's the one we have the most experience with. It's all the mangrove zones, the beaches, the rocky shorelines, mud flats and salt marshes. They have really high light levels because light penetrates nicely down to about 200 meter level. The salinity is affected by rivers and things coming in and water running off the land, and it's heavily affected by tides. The neritic zone is also the same depth. It goes down to about 200 meters, but it's the bit that doesn't have any land under it. So it doesn't have a shoreline. It's the open water, top edge of the open water. It's only about 200 meters deep. All plankton loves to live there. It's got stable temperature and lots of light. This is where most of the life is found in the oceans, either in our intertidal coastal littoral zones and this neritic pelagic zone. The next one down is called the baffle zone. it's almost completely dark. Light doesn't penetrate very far down here. And the red, with the shortest wavelength, the red light is the first to go. So no red light ever gets down into the bathyl zone, which means if you are a red organism, like this one, you colored red, there is no red wavelengths of light down there that is natural to actually reflect off your surface. So you are effectively invisible. So you find a lot of organisms down here are bright red colored because it makes them invisible down there. There is no light to reflect off them. No, none of those wavelengths actually reach down there. Because there's very little light, you don't get plants in this zone, just animals. Animals in this zone are often bioluminescent, or they use other senses in order to get around and navigate because there's so little light in this zone. The last three zones, the abyssal, the hadal, and the benthic zone, are incredibly deep, very high pressure, and have no natural light at all, completely black. Because it's so deep, there is absolutely no plants down here. But what we do find is that there's things like hydrothermal vents, where instead of doing photosynthesis, because there's no light, you can't do it down there, organisms and bacteria and things do chemosynthesis down there. They're creating energy out of different chemicals that bubble up out of the hot zones, volcanic zones at the bottom of the ocean. And you find some really cool organisms adapted to live down here in these zones. Make sure that you've taken some good notes down from this video and that you are ready to do a compare and contrast to terrestrial ecosystems next lesson.